catalyzing large-scale carbon dioxide removal. Today we have 4 expert guest speakers with us to share their experience and, more importantly, their different perspectives on these issues. I will ask them in a moment to introduce themselves personally. But just to remind ourselves here that this will be a discussion around a virtual campfire. There'll be no big speeches. The idea is to discuss, and then during the second part, toward the second part of the event, we'll open up the discussion for question and answers from the participants. So let me start by introducing myself. I am Janos Pasztor. I'm the Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. I've been doing this since 2016, after I retired from the UN, as my last position there was Assistant Secretary General for Climate Change, working on various issues. Before, I worked in many other UN entities, including the UN Environment Program, many years in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but also in a number of civil society organizations such as WWF. So I've been basically working on climate change for the last 4 decades. And obviously I haven't done a very good job, because there's still work left undone. So there's plenty to do. With that, let me ask my colleagues who are speakers today. Artur, would you like to start by introducing yourself?
Thank you very much, Janos. I'm Artur Runge-Metzger. I'm working with the European Commission and also spent, I think, most of those decades as Janos on climate change in terms of international climate policy as part of the European negotiation team, but then also in the run-up to the Paris Agreement, trying to broker the deal, and afterwards mainly focusing on European Union legislation and support programs on climate change.
Thank you, Artur. Louise, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you, Janos, and hello, everyone. I'm Louise Jeffery. I'm currently a climate policy analyst at NewClimate Institute, based in Berlin in Germany. I'm a little bit newer to the scene than some of you, but I've been working in international climate policy for around 8 years now, having previously trained as an earth scientist. My areas of work are on mitigation, mostly focusing on the country level, looking at countries' different targets through the Climate Action Tracker, for example. More recently, been looking at the land use component of those targets and how carbon dioxide removal can contribute to that.
Thank you, Louise. Mark, would you like to continue?
Thanks very much for this invitation, and thank you, Janos. So good afternoon. My name is Mark Workman. I'm a specialist in strategic foresight. So I essentially use mixed methods to identify risks and opportunities and different possible futures. I'm also director for an organization called Foresight Transitions, and I work with a team that provides strategy and decision support tools across energy, environment, and technology sectors, including greenhouse gas removal. Been working in the sort of greenhouse gas removal or carbon dioxide removal space for the best part of 10 to 12 years. And have co-founded the Carbon Removal Centre, which seeks an open and participatory and inclusive approach to exploring carbon removal at establishment scale up. I'm an engineer and economist by academic training, ex-military, ex-commerce, and now I sit at the interface between academia and industry. And with that, I'm a visiting researcher at Imperial College London. Thank
you, Mark. And Jason?
Hi, thanks. Also happy to be here. I'm Jason Ice, Executive Director of Vivid Economics. We're a UK-based consultancy working at the policy and commercial nexus on climate change and sustainability more broadly. I work, I guess, both with policy and policy makers' decisions, but also quite heavily with the commercial sector, I guess, both corporates and financial institutions involved in essentially addressing various aspects of climate change in the energy and the land use space, with a very significant emphasis in recent years on greenhouse gas removal, particularly from nature-based or natural climate solutions.
Thank you, Jason. And let me then say a few words about the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. We're funded from philanthropy. We have 16 people working virtually, even before COVID, on 3 continents. And we have a very simple mission, and that is to catalyze the creation of effective governance when it comes to approaches that alter the climate, such as in particular carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. Our position is that we're impartial on the use or not of these approaches, or which approach to use or not to use. One important part of our strategy is to encourage learning through conversations like this one and many others that we have organized, for example, in our C2G Learn series. In this series, we were able to engage over 50 experts from different parts of the world to speak on different issues. Now, the purpose of these events is to show the diversity of views. The purpose is not to come up with a negotiated outcome for each meeting, but it's really to show that there is a diversity of views, and different speakers coming from different experiences, different cultural, political, and organizational backgrounds may end up having very different perspectives. Now, for having different perspectives, we of course have to have many different people, but you can only have so many people on an individual campfire chat. We of course try to maximize the diversity of our speakers, both in terms of geography, in terms of gender and socio-political context. But we obviously can't achieve that at every webinar and every campfire chat. But on the whole, I think with our 50 experts, we've done well. But obviously some campfire chats end up with different kind of diversity than others. I would like to say a few words about terminology. This will come up a couple of times. Different people, different institutions call these things different things. And of course, very often we use acronyms. We'll try to use as little of that as possible. We tend to use in C2G terminology that is used usually by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So we talk about carbon dioxide removal, or CDR. In some places they call that greenhouse gas removal. That's fine. It's a broader term, but it means mostly the same thing. We just have to be clear, each one of us, when we speak, to be clear about what we mean by the terms that we're making use of. And then one final word on that, of course, the idea here is to have different people express different perspectives. And these are, of course, not the views of, or not necessarily the views of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. Now, a few words about the context in which we're having these discussions. I don't think we need to have a detailed discussion about the serious climate crisis that the world is facing. We're slightly over 1 degree above historical average, and the impacts are clear, whether we go to the Arctic, whether we go to see the forest fires in different parts of the world, or for that matter, the extreme heat that we see in many different local situations. We have also seen for many years, but in particular the IPCC special report on 1.5 degree, that we must, that the emission reduction activities of countries should be going into turbo mode, if I can put it that way, to massively reduce the emissions. But even if those emission reduction plans are in turbo mode, we still need some level of carbon dioxide removal. First, to offset the difficult to remove emissions, such as in some of the industrial sectors, and then eventually to absolutely remove carbon from the atmosphere to achieve net negative. And but the situation is still serious, and some scientists are even saying that we may need things beyond emission reductions and carbon removal, such as solar radiation modification. Now, that's not going to be the topic of the discussion today, but I just thought that it would be important to mention. The focus here is on the governance issues that arise in relation to catalyzing research, development, and deployment of large-scale carbon dioxide removal. One interesting thing is that, even since we started planning these events, is that increasing number of countries that have recently committed themselves to net zero by 2050 or 2060, like in the case of China. And that gives a particular impetus for talking about some of the governance challenges that we're facing, and I'm sure we'll be coming to that in a moment. These are the type of governance questions that arise is, of course, which techniques to use and when. Should it be nature-based solutions or technology-based solutions or hybrid solutions approaches? And what kind of societal discussions need to take place before options are decided upon some of the interesting governance challenges. Now, so I don't think we're going to be able to address all of these in our discussions today, but I hope we can contribute to some and thereby move the agenda forward. Now, for the sake of our participants, what we will do is I would like to start the discussion by asking one question from each of our guest speakers. And then we'll have a discussion with the speakers themselves. And then toward the second part of the time that we have allotted, which is 90 minutes for the total of this session, we will open up for question and answers from the participants. So dear participants, please use the Q&A button on the Zoom menu to leave your questions there. You can already start doing that now, but we'll address them a little bit later in the session. You see that in the Q&A menu, there's a like button. So if there's a question that you like, that's a good way to increase the importance of that question. That's because if we have many questions, we may not be able to address them all. Then we'll start looking at the ones that have many likes. So please make use of that functionality. There's also a chat functionality. If you feel like chatting, that's fine. But if you want to put a question, please put it in the Q&A and not under the chat. So with that, let's get going. And I would like to start by asking each guest. And maybe as a first, I'd like to start with Louise, if I may. Louise, maybe if you could help us from your perspective to give us a few ideas on what are some of the key options that we have available for carbon dioxide removal. And related to this, if you could also address in the short time, 2 to 3 minutes, of course, how you see the difference between removing emissions at a point source versus actually removing carbon from the atmosphere in an absolute sense. So over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Janos. So yeah, as you've said, we started our work here with this perspective that some carbon dioxide removal will be needed. How much and when is still to be determined, but we will need some, probably quite a lot. And yes, this big question is, how do we actually support that? How do we get things moving and scale things up? In some work we did last year, we identified a few different things that are already happening. These include various different regulation options. There are different tax incentives. The EU, for example, has targeted innovation funding. I think Artur will speak to that a bit later. And we also looked into some other options that are not yet so well developed, and that includes the idea of using carbon offsets to support carbon dioxide removal. But on that one, we actually found that it's maybe not such a good idea for a couple of reasons. One being an issue of permanence. To have an effective offsetting system, a ton of CO2 emitted must be equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide removed. And we need to be 100% sure that that carbon removed or stored will not be released into the atmosphere. And we find that with most options available to us right now, that is not the case. So one thing we found, at least recently, is that carbon offsetting has quite a lot of risks when it comes to carbon dioxide support. Instead, we then started looking a bit more at the big picture and what could be a good support option. And one first important starting point is the framing. And that comes in in setting targets, and that's both at the country level and at the company level. So how do you set a target for emissions reductions and incorporate carbon dioxide removal? And you've just mentioned these net zero targets and how many more we're getting, and I think that's really great. But as we start to dig into those a bit deeper, we also need to be sure we're setting good net zero targets. And for us, that means having a component of both emissions reductions, which really need to happen and happen quickly, and a component of carbon dioxide removal. And having these two components allows us some transparency and also to ensure that both are happening at the same time. Of course, that's not the whole picture. There are many other questions, and how do you actually implement that? What kind of policies do you need? But maybe those are some questions we can dig into in our discussions today. Do I still have 30 seconds to address your second question, or shall we come back to that?
Why don't you do that quickly?
All right.
Why don't you go?
Yeah. All right. So I understand you asked me about how I see the difference between capturing carbon at its source versus really capturing carbon. So for me, the difference here is we're capturing carbon at its source. So if we are burning fossil fuels or through industrial processes that emit carbon dioxide, we then capture that and store it. We're preventing it from being released into the atmosphere. We're reducing our emissions, but that doesn't make a net, that's not removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We're not reducing atmospheric CO2 concentrations. We have other approaches, which I'm sure the others can get into, but plants are great at doing this. Photosynthesis captures carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and stores it as biomass. And that is then, at least for a longer term, really captured and removed from the atmosphere. And of course, there are other methods to do that as well. So for me, that's the difference. Are we reducing our emissions, or are we really removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere?
Okay, then one more quick follow-up question, if I may, going on to the next. But you mentioned permanence a couple of times, and this difference between removal and offsetting current emissions. So just very briefly, how do you see the governance implications of these issues?
The governance in terms of permanence, do you mean between the different types of approaches?
Well, if permanence is such an important issue, then what should governance at the international or domestic level do about that? And how would you go about it?
I think there are different things. And so, for example, the likelihood of permanence or the duration of storage for different carbon dioxide removal approaches is different. So for land use-based options, for example, the duration of storage may be shorter and it's very easily reversed. And there, I think we need to be very careful to still support it and encourage it, because it has many co-benefits. It's cheap, but we have to be careful not to make it equivalent to, for example, a reduction of fossil fuel emissions. The questions get more difficult when it's, for example, direct air capture and then carbon storage, which we think has a longer term, or likely a longer term storage. So I think we need slightly different approaches to the governance and policies regulating and monitoring these different approaches.
Okay, well, thank you. We might come back to some of these issues, but I'd like to go on now to Artur. If I may ask you, we know that the EU has been very much a leading force on carbon and climate neutrality, and maybe if you could share with us a little bit your experience of the governance issues that the EU has been able to resolve already, and some of the other governance issues that are still remaining to be addressed that come out of the experience from where you are. Just your mic, please, and keep your mics on.
Yes, thank you, Janos. In terms of experience and what needs to be done, I think the IPCC special report on 1.5 brought it home very clearly. What the role of carbon dioxide removals could be in the future. And if we are honest, I think the current governance system that we inherit from the Kyoto Protocol does not fully address that. So that is something that we will have to look at in the coming years. And the first thing, I think Louise is right on that, is you need to set yourself a target that includes both, on one side, the emissions, and on the other side, the removals. And that is what the Commission and the EU has been doing over the last year. So in December last year, our heads of state said very clearly we want to go for climate neutrality, which means net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. And at the present point in time, there's discussions on how to put this even into a European law for the very first time. So these discussions are ongoing. The second thing is that you need to look at the transparency side, which is the monitoring, reporting, and verification. I think there is a lot of experience that we have already, but I think we need to make sure that this monitoring, reporting, verification will really capture the issue. And one of those is what Louise was mentioning, that you need to distinguish between those that really reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere and the others that, okay, capture before it goes as an emission into the atmosphere. So I think that's something that needs to be taken into account. We do this already today in the sectors that are covered by the European emissions trading system, because if your plant and installation is linked to a CCS plant, your emission that you have caught is no longer going to be called and recorded as an emission, and you don't have to surrender any certificates for that. So for that particular operation, there is already an incentive in place. But that is not yet going to be wide enough because we also need to see this in the context of all the other sectors. And then thirdly, it is the issue of the nature-based solutions or approaches, as some might say. And there's the issue of the permanence. And that is not only for the nature-based ones, but it's also for the things that now come into play is the carbon capture and use, where it is circulating within the economy, and you need to see what is happening at the end of the day and for how long is it going to be stored somewhere in the material. And here I think the important thing is to acknowledge that we are living in a dynamic system. So we will have things that are not permanent. Still, they can be helpful, even if they store things over time. You just need to be very honest about it and very transparent about it, so that you don't call something permanent that is not going to be permanent at a certain point in time. And then you will have to find devices on how are you going to deal with that in your legislation. And if you remember back under the clean development mechanism, when we were dealing with forest projects there, we were issuing particular certificates, temporary certificates at the time. So that was one solution that has been tried in the past. But what we can see is that that was probably not very successful because it did not lead really to the number of projects that you would require. Because that's our main worry, that nature-based approaches are very useful and they are very economic as well. So they can contribute, but you must be able to measure, report, and verify those. And you must make sure that you address the issue of permanence, because permanence is always linked to also liability at the end. That question on what happens if a forest goes up in flames. Is the certificate holder the one who's going to lose, or is it the one who created and earned the certificate? So these are questions that in a governance structure will have to be addressed. And I think I stop here.
Artur, this is great. I really appreciated the way you described that. If it's not necessarily permanent, it doesn't mean it's bad, right? Yeah. One has to be transparent about what it is. Right. And maybe just a very quick question, sort of 30 seconds if you can, but it looks like that the EU has done quite a bit of work in this area, and maybe that's not quite the case for the whole UNFCCC process. How do you see the two connecting, maybe one helping the other to get moving in the same way?
I think the way we would see it is that, of course, it's not only in Europe, but also in other places in the world where experiences are being gathered. And at a certain stage, this needs to come together. Mm-hmm. And that needs to be reflected in the whole Paris Agreement, the transparency rules in one way or the other. I think that is where it will have to culminate at a certain point in time. And then to try to avoid a repetition of all the discussions we had under the Kyoto Protocol. I think that would be good if we would have a little bit of a process where convergence would happen a little earlier.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, Jason, I'd like to come to you now. And you were recently quoted in a Bloomberg article about the huge potential opportunities for carbon removal, negative emissions from oil and gas companies. And so it's pretty clear that we will need massive investments that will be needed for carbon removal, especially if we need to do a lot, to use Louise's phrase here. And but then there are many people feel that oil companies have no role to fix a problem that they may have created. So what's your thought on this? How do they have a role? And if they do, what is it? And what is the potential? And how can they engage with the rest of society to make this actually happen?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and I'll go a bit beyond oil and gas companies. I don't think they're necessarily the only or the most major kind of private sector player driving this market. But to address that specific question, I mean, we've seen across the board, companies seeking to offset their emissions and making commitments to offset those emissions. In a way, the oil and gas companies were amongst the earlier ones to announce this, and some other high emitting sectors like aviation. But actually in the last year or so, we've seen it spread quite rapidly across other sectors with major commitments by folks like Microsoft or Google or what have you. And I think broadly speaking, regardless of the oil and gas sector per se, I think there's an important role in those commitments, which currently are voluntary, and they're currently smallish scale, but beginning to be at least of a sizable enough scale to be more interesting and perhaps prove models that could really be at scale. So really moving beyond, I think, where we've been stuck for many years and in very small projects, largely subsidized with a variety of complicated mechanisms. I think the desire and the commitments made by the private sector to start to push offsets as an avenue of market development is quite promising. But I mean, I agree with Louise in the first instance that it's not a feasible decarbonization pathway to think that we're going to offset emissions from oil and gas with these negative emissions technologies, particularly with NBS, which has been largely the first swath of kind of offsets that people have targeted. Both the decarbonization of our power and our transport systems have to happen very rapidly, and offsets are largely an additional aspect to our trajectory towards net zero. I'm less pedantic about whether oil and gas companies can or can't play a role in that. I think regardless of whether they're decarbonizing their core business quickly, it can be a reasonable business proposition for them to hedge some of the decline in their core business with exposure to a possible upside from carbon renewable technologies. I think it's a reasonable diversification strategy for them, and I don't see that as necessarily contradictory. I think it's possible, and I do see a potentially productive role from them and other sector players in helping spark the market. But I think it's important to put that in perspective. Offsets at the scale of a voluntary market with some corporate commitments is a nice start, but it's not going to be what's required to achieve the market at scale. And I think the private sector is active in this space, from the corporates themselves to the investors that might be interested in financing some of this stuff. It's very clear that we need what they require, and it's what the private sector always requires, right? They need a clarity of a revenue model. They need to understand that the costs, especially the transaction costs related to MRV and ensuring permanence and all of that needs to be reasonable enough to allow for some profit, because that's the way the private sector works. And risks need to be manageable. They need to have sufficient belief that they can control the risks themselves, and they're not subject to uncontrollable risks that make it basically a feasible risk return environment. And we're really lacking some core elements of that right now, right? I mean, a voluntary market and the kind of prices and value created in a voluntary market are way too small for the types of revenue streams that we require. We need to move to compliance markets. We need governments to set the rules clearly. And those rules can include all that's required to ensure permanence, to reduce leakage. They just need to be clear, and they need to ensure that there's a revenue model. And once that's set up, people will manage these risks. They'll manage permanence. They'll find mechanisms to ensure against forest fire. But you need a clarity on that market arrangement, which we're still not there yet. We can come back to that. And I think you need to make sure that market arrangement has a reasonable amount of risk, a balance of risk between that the private sector can control. So some aspects of a solution which tie returns on these offsets to, let's say, jurisdictional targets, reference levels. We can go into detail on that later if you want, but those create risks that are far out of control for the private sector and make it quite a difficult investment proposition. So the private sector's perspective on this is probably what it usually is. But a lot of it, I think, in reaching the scale is in the hands of setting up, a set of market conditions that enable just a simply reasonable profit, risk return profile for those investors.
So thank you, Jason. And it's good to underline here what you said, that governments have an important role to create the appropriate conditions, the rules, so that then the private sector can do what they have to do. Otherwise, it gets messy. Okay, so look, we've thank you very much. Now, I'd like to encourage our guests, if you have any questions you want to pose to each other, feel free to do so. If you have any, please go ahead and let's see if we can have a little bit of a discussion. I see Mark sort of moving there, something. Are you ready for that?
Yeah. I mean, I've got a load of questions. I mean, I was going to actually be able to seek a counterweight to a lot of the uncertainties that the other members of the team of the panel had highlighted. So shall I just go into that?
Yeah.
Janos. So in terms of my background in this space, it tends to be sort of desktop-based and ethnographic, using pluralistic and participatory approaches. And one of the main sort of centers of gravity of the team's work, or the teams that I've been working with, has been around the design of an accelerator with a view and its associated components, because not only are we trying to develop a technology here, we're trying to create an entire market from a standing start, almost a standing start. And so therefore the need to assess how to bring through the technologies, what the policy and regulatory constructs might be, what the societal engagement mechanisms might be, and who the relevant audiences are in the appropriate contexts are absolutely fundamental in all this. So in terms of sort of the theory of change as to how the accelerator might come and address some of the points that were made by all the panel members, we're talking about designing a sector in the best scenarios from the IPCC that's the same size at a liquid CO2 level as the oil and gas sector, but obviously pulling liquid CO2 in the opposite direction, or at some of the sort of the median projections around 3 to 4 times the liquid CO2 that the oil and gas sector moves in terms of oil. We're talking about creating a sector under deep uncertainty, and at a level of rate of urgency, if the modelling is to be considered appropriate, that's unprecedented. And as a function of this, a lot of the barriers are probably socio-political, which plays to a lot of what Jason was talking about and what Artur was talking about. So the complication is that the asymmetries are substantive, both in absolute terms, i.e. epistemologically and ornithologically, but also between the different actors that are taking part within the space. And we're talking about a really fragmented space. I mean, the agricultural sector, the cement sector, the aerospace sector, the steel sector, culturally, lexiconically, very, very different organizations. Both the actors and the people that they need to engage with, it's highly fragmented and complex. And the appetite for risk is pretty limited, particularly with C19. And Jason has kind of highlighted that issue. The political risk at the moment would be absolutely substantive, as is evidenced as to what's going on in America today. So the question is, how can we address these things? How can we create a petri dish that generates evidence as to what the business models might be, what the policy issues might be in the face of deep uncertainty? And our argument has been to co-develop an accelerator. And the idea behind the accelerator would be to generate all the levels of knowledge needed around the sector to start populating this high dimensional space as to what's needed to create a greenhouse gas removal sector, that it be market-based, how much is underpinned by regulation, and so on. With a view to therefore developing convening power around this accelerator, better coordination. I don't know what Jason's thoughts are with regards to how the private sector finds the transaction costs of engaging within the space. I suspect they're quite substantive. Capacity development within sectors and across different sectors, creating some kind of runway, because if you have an accelerator and you have people investing, you create critical mass. And if anyone's read the latest edition of The Economist, only £80 billion a year goes into climate relevant R&D, and that needs to scale substantially. And only a tiny proportion of that goes into carbon removal. And so, that's what we're looking at. If we can develop these tools to bring people together to start populating the uncertainty space and all the other anthropological benefits that come about, that for me would seek to address some of the issues that the team has raised. And I hope that's been a useful contribution.
Thank you, Mark. And just quickly, two questions, if I may, before we get into the discussion. One is, I don't know if I understood you correctly, but you were talking early on about the total need is for essentially the same order of magnitude of carbon removal in terms of volume than the oil and gas flows today. Can you explain a little bit more what you meant? Maybe I misunderstood you.
No, it's fine. So Jason, the Vivid's report last week, which was very good, Jason, by the way. So they put a lower bound in terms of where the IPCC scenarios have got the amounts of carbon removal needed at 2.5 gigatons. And the median across all the IPCC scenarios that meet 1.5 degrees is around 12 gigatons. And so at a 10 atmospheres liquid CO2 volume, if you take the lower bound, it's around what the size of the oil and gas sector extracts in liquid hydrocarbons. You need to put down at about, so on equivalence. So that's if we mitigate substantively, we only need 2.5 gigatons per year to be removed. But in liquid terms, that's about the equivalent of the oil and gas sector is today. And then obviously with the median, you've got about 3 or 4 times the size of the oil and gas sector. So where that leads to is that ultimately, and Jason again touched upon it, but was quite diplomatic about it, we're almost certainly going to need the likes of the oil and gas sector, because if you're going to have to scale an industry up 3 or 4 times, it's good to actually have a bit of a head start with an outfit that has that critical mass of expertise, albeit taking liquids in the opposite directions that we want to take them in within this particular sector. But how you address the culture and how you get the sector to address the carbon removal need as an absolute, rather than to avoid asset stranding of their present assets, is something that Jason's probably eminently more qualified to address than me.
And maybe in the discussion that will follow, we can ask Jason to react to that, and maybe the others as well, Louise and Artur. But 2 things I want to mention before. One is that we've been asked to speak not too fast, so let's keep that in mind. Secondly, I'd like to remind our participants to ask questions. I see one already coming up, so we can park that for the moment. We'll come to those in a moment, but please go ahead and prepare your questions. And then Mark, just one more question, and that might then hopefully lead into this discussion. You mentioned about, this is interesting, this what you're trying to pull together, but I was wondering how it might relate to the formal UNFCCC process, because particularly when you talk about convening and coordination between different actors, then I need to ask that question, and maybe you have some thoughts on that, and maybe Artur also has some reactions to that. So why don't you go ahead, and then I'd like to open the discussion in the group.
Okay, well, in terms of governance, there is no treaty on the atmosphere, which is the inherent governance gap that we've got with regards to climate change. So it fits, and I mean quite why I'm saying this to you, Janos. Ultimately, it's within the UN infrastructure setup. It probably falls between the gaps, and you'll be more qualified to answer this. You know, is this issue a development issue? I think some carbon removal plays have a developmental component. Is it an environmental play? I would argue that some elements of the co-benefits of carbon dioxide removal have an environmental play. In terms of, do we need a completely standalone governance setup? My instinct is that we shouldn't. We should use the present systems that we have as imperfect or as they may be, or otherwise. And in terms of the accelerator, I think that there should be an association with some kind of UNFCCC mechanism, because the UNFCCC, in essence, will be establishing the monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements. In essence, does that by default through the COP process. And so the argument would be that it would feed into the UN system. The accelerator would feed in information through the UN system, and that it would link in terms of some kind of processes to allow to identify which technologies and which policies and regulatory constructs and business models and finance mechanisms would be relevant to greenhouse gas removal technologies. So I've fumbled my answer a bit, but hopefully I've answered some of it.
Okay, well, let's have maybe the other colleagues react to some of what you said, but I just want to mention that the lack of a treaty for the atmosphere came up already in 2 other Campfire Chats we had recently. So this is obviously an issue that you're not the only one who is concerned about that. Okay, can I ask my colleagues here if they would like to react in particular to the issue of the private sector and how these issues might relate with the formal intergovernmental processes? Artur, you have your hands up, so go ahead.
Of course, there is a big link between what is happening at the international negotiations in the UNFCCC and then private sector. Because I think Jason was putting it very clearly, and also Mark, that you need to have a regulatory framework. It's not happening on its own. These big carbon removals. And I think that is also something, if you look at our our modeling, what we do when we set targets and when we look at how can we fulfill them, what you will see is that the carbon removal technologies are not the cheapest technologies. And that's the reason why they not fall like manna from heaven at the present point in time. So the business model is not there. I was involved in the exercise about 10 to 15 years ago when in Europe we said we need to build 12 large demonstration plants on carbon capture and storage. And there is not a single that has been built since then. And it's all the economics that don't work at the present point in time. There's, I think, only if you link it really with enhanced oil recovery, the numbers make sense. Otherwise, it doesn't. The examples we have in terms of the big ones in Norway, the Sleipner field works because Norway puts a huge tax on every ton of carbon dioxide that the company otherwise would release into the atmosphere. And that makes it economically attractive to run the Sleipner field. So we will need to build the economics, and that can only be built if the ambition is going to increase over time. We have just presented in Europe a minus 55% target. And if you look at the impact assessment, you get at carbon prices, maybe 40, maybe 50, maybe 60 euros per ton of carbon dioxide. And there is many carbon removal projects that will not be profitable, as Jason was putting it, at that price. So therefore, I think the large scale removals you will probably see not within the next 10 years. But what we need to do in the next 10 years is to test those technologies in order to make sure that they can really work. And that's where we spend and are going to spend a lot of money from our innovation funding, where we try, for instance, in one of the big steel plants to capture carbon dioxide that is coming from biomass, and then ethanol is being produced. So these are the CCU type of projects. We look into the infrastructure that you require, because that's one of the big problems in the past, that there is no business model for the infrastructure. If you need to lay pipes where you pipe carbon dioxide, it's just not there. And the same is true on the nature side, because at the present point in time, farmers and foresters are not directly incentivized in order to use their stocks and to increase their stocks, whether it's in the soil or whether it is in the standing forest. So that link also needs to be made in order to have a business case at the end of the day for those types of solutions. So it's on both sides, whether it is the technology side, and where probably oil and gas companies have a comparative advantage because they were pumping out of the earth something that now needs to be pumped back into the earth. And I think they have all the technology and the know-how for that, is hampered in expanding that. And the same is true also on the nature-based side. So these are some of the things of the conundrum that we will have to solve in the coming years. And the UNFCCC side is, one is the transparency in order to make sure a ton that is counted in Europe is a ton counted in the United States or in China or wherever. And it is also about the ambition level, because that is being governed by the UN. There's nobody, or let's say not all countries in the world want to be running ahead. They want to run together, but not alone.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to encourage my colleagues to react also, but while they're thinking about that, can I come back to something you said, Artur, because I thought that was important. You said the economics don't work, we need to rebuild that. And you mentioned something about carbon price. Is that the only thing to do in that area, just to have a substantial carbon price? Or can you say a few words about, from your perspective, of how that might work?
I think the carbon price, of course, runs the economics, the profitability of carbon, any kind of carbon removal project at the end of the day. How you achieve that carbon price, whether it is through a tax or a carbon market, I think business will not care at the end of the day, but the economics need to work out. If it doesn't work, it's just not going to happen. That is what we are seeing at the present point in time. And as you know, these prices are going to be driven by the targets that you are going to set. If you set weak targets, it means you will have a weak carbon price. It practically means, okay, there is no real need for carbon removals. So you also need to take from the IPCC kind of the implicit carbon prices that you need in order to get to those scenarios the IPCC has been running in their 1.5 special report.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Louise, can I ask you something here? Because maybe if you could just help us to move along in our thinking. We've talked a lot about what we need to do now, and Artur mentioned the next 10 years, no large scale, but we need to do testing and development and so on. But often the whole thinking seems to stop in 2050. And yet we know that life doesn't stop in 2050. So there are lots of things we will have to do after 2050. And I guess the question I'd like to ask from your perspective of how some of the governance challenges that we're facing today might need to be adjusted in order to be sure that we can be ready for what happens after 2050.
Yeah, thanks, Janos. And I think this is a really interesting question, that this challenge, we to some extent know what challenge lies ahead, and at least the big picture, but it will change through time. And we're at the point today where we are testing out different options, finding out what works well, what does not, why we can bring prices down and why not. And yeah, we have a couple of options on the table. We can already remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but as I said, it's limited. We need to scale up. But in the hopes that some of those do work out well, in 30 years' time, we will hopefully be in the position where we are at close to net zero CO2 or at net zero CO2. That's the goal, right? Net zero CO2 by 2050. What happens after 2050? We want to be net negative. And that means we are going to have to be in a position where we're removing more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than we're emitting. And in that case, I was helpfully reminded of it earlier by someone that we need to have carbon dioxide removal being even cheaper than emitting carbon dioxide. And how do we get to that point? How do we set things up such that removing carbon dioxide is actually appealing and something that we want to do even more than just equalizing our current emissions? And that's, I guess, also related again to this offsetting. It's not just that we want to be one out, one in the ground kind of situation, but for every ton of CO2 we're emitting, we're storing 2 tons of CO2. And I think to some extent it's good that we have that 30 years to scale up to that, but I think we do need to be setting up our systems now with that perspective in mind, that at some point it's got to be even more carbon dioxide removed than we're emitting.
Yeah.
And exactly how we do that, I don't know, but at least to some extent we do have a few years to answer those questions. And again, these discussions help with that a lot.
Maybe it's a good time for me to ask something from Jason here, because the UK is going to host COP26 next year, and the UK has provided a certain leadership in this area, and maybe you could say a few words about that and how we can answer Louise's question of how we're going to make this work, maybe building on what the UK has been doing as examples, and any thoughts on that. And while you're thinking of your response, I just want to remind our participants to pose their questions. I see already two of them are coming in, so bring on those questions, and we'll soon start looking at those. But Jason, over to you.
Right. I think it's really important to segment a bit what we think are the key, carbon dioxide removal technologies, let's say. And although the first bucket's a variety of techniques, I mean, we've got nature-based solutions, like broadly speaking, I would say. We've got bioenergy with some form of CCS, and we've got sort of, something along the lines of direct air capture. And I think it's fair to say that each of those solutions are very different in terms of where they are economically, and also are very different in terms of the time frame in which they might play a major role in our decarbonization pathway. And from the point of view of nature-based solutions, the major barriers aren't economic. They're about structuring the regulatory and market environment. And the major challenges have been about how and in what way to include them in the broader market incentives or regulatory incentives for decarbonization. Now, there have been issues with MRV. I think MRV technology has in the past. So that's monitoring, reporting, and verifying of those emissions. That has been a barrier, but I think there's actually been very large advances, and I don't believe that's now the material barrier to it. I mean, especially in advanced countries, but increasingly in developing countries that have invested quite a lot, or with assistance have invested quite a lot in MRV systems. You can come up with a reasonable MRV framework, and we're seeing that starting to be reflected in policies such as in the UK, where and not just the UK. I mean, we've seen it in California, New Zealand, Australia, where they have started to set up mechanisms through which nature-based solutions can be incorporated into a broader regulatory market environment for decarbonization and eventually achievement of net zero and beyond. And I think that's very important. And those are things where I think it's really about getting the like I said, the market mechanism set up, the reasonable conditions for private investment to feel that they can get a reasonable return at a controllable risk. And even at carbon prices of today in the EU, let's say of 20 to 30 euros, there would be substantial numbers of projects that would get done that aren't getting done today. That's not sufficient necessarily for the larger scale, although it's hard to tell. We haven't scaled it enough to know how much some of these solutions will really cost in the long run. But even at 20 or 30 euro carbon prices that we're seeing, those are reasonably scalable solutions. I mean, we're seeing projects getting done at a quarter of those prices. But I think for larger scale, we'll need to get to closer to 2030 and maybe up to 40 or 50. But anyway, those are there. I mean, the second bucket, BECCS, of course, it suffers from some of the sustainability issues associated with MBS, but also, of course, with CCS just not being demonstrated at scale yet. And that's exactly what Artur was talking about. I mean, it's been a decade of kind of people talking about the need for government support for it. There's all sorts of reasons it's not happened, but there's still a large issue around the infrastructure and the cost of that, and who's going to bear the cost of that, and that market's simply not going to get there unless there's a big push on that. And there's big questions about how worthwhile that push is in terms of the amount of negative emissions we can get from bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. I personally think it has an important role to play. I think it's something that should be pushed, but it's not going to be something that we can get moving in the next 5 or even 10 years at scale. It's going to take a whole long period of investment in that infrastructure, demonstration of those projects, assurance of permanent renewal before we get there. But you could get there, and you could probably get there in a range of $100 per ton, I would think. You know, there's some uncertainty there, but you could probably get there to $100 per ton, and that's going to be a relevant point for us in the 2030s and maybe 2040s. You know, direct air capture, which Mark will have a lot more to say about, you know, the price point on that is still very uncertain. These technologies are very early stage. As Mark said, they were going to require a lot of policy support around R&D and demonstration. That, for instance, is what the UK has started to do, but I think you're going to see that across, and I know the EU has done a good deal of that. You're going to see it, I think, in the US, if there's a new push into low carbon innovation, but that's going to be a longer term play. It's going to take a while to get through the RD&D cycle and to get down to the prices at scale that are reasonable. And we're not there yet. I mean, even if you think the prices are going to come down to 150, 200, even a little bit below that, that's a solution for us that's really in the 2040s at scale, or maybe the 2050s. So you have to think about kind of how you're creating the policy environment and how you're creating a market for the private sector to start pushing this at very different stages and with very different economics underlying them.
Thank you. I'd like to open up, starting with some of the questions from the participants, but before I do that, a very quick point to follow up what you said earlier, Jason, and this is not just to you, but to any of you. What role do we see for large-scale carbon dioxide removal for the developing countries? Now, I say this knowing that there is nobody from the developing countries on this panel. Okay, that's what it is. But Jason, when you talked about California, about Europe, about the UK, and so on. But how do we see that, at least from your perspectives? And any of you would like to briefly address that, and then I'd like to go to the questions from the participants.
Can I take a first shot at that? Sorry, hogging the floor, but I think, look, I mean, ask them, right? I mean, they have published their NDCs. Many of the developing countries have a large amount of their expectation of reaching their nationally determined contributions through land use based sequestration. You know, you just look at any of the large countries, Indonesia, the Amazon countries, almost all of them have stated that that's a large proportion of their pathway to achieving their Paris goals. So I think they certainly see it as key to what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts on that? If not, then let me. Yes, go ahead, Louise.
I was just going to say, I think there's two dimensions to it, right? There's how an individual country achieves its own goal, so how a developing country might achieve its own NDC, and that might be domestically through emissions reductions. But I think another governance question that's important to ask is, for example, how the UK or EU might see some domestic carbon dioxide removal, and how they see supporting or achieving carbon dioxide removal elsewhere and in other countries. And I think that also then has major issues, and that's particularly relevant to these land-based solutions. Does supporting afforestation in Indonesia, Brazil count towards the UK's emissions target? And there, I think, we get into a lot of complicated issues, but I think also worth keeping in mind.
Okay, all right. I'd like to put a question based on one of the questions from the participants to Artur. And this participant states, offsets don't reduce the overall atmospheric concentrations of CO2. The 1.5 report of the IPCC is clear about remaining carbon budget. So why are we still talking about offsets? What role do they play? And what is the EU experience in this regard?
I think we were talking about offsets in the past. And when I introduced the example of the emissions trading system, that is where you were talking about offsets. So you burn some fossil fuel and you make sure that the CO2 from the burning of the fossil fuel doesn't get into the atmosphere. And then you capture that, and that I would think is an offset. But what we are now looking forward to since the 1.5 report, and I think she is right on this, is carbon removal that gives you a net benefit to the atmosphere at the end of the day. I think that is where the legislative framework also will have to move to. So I think I'm fully with her in that, in terms of that question.
Okay. All right. Then Mark, a question toward you, but again, and I'm pointing them to one of you, but if others have a different view, please say so. So it's pretty clear that some of the removal systems will have massive energy needs, and we haven't really addressed that. Can you say a few words about that, of what that means and what we should do about that?
Well, it depends on the technology. So obviously there's some work that a colleague of mine, Ajay Gambhir, did around direct air capture that suggested, I think, for the gigaton scale removal, you needed something like 1/4 of the global electricity supply. And that's an inherent developmental issue, how you can develop efficient process efficiencies within, or indeed new mechanisms of removing carbon dioxide. So yes, some do, and obviously the play around bioenergy carbon capture and storage actually generates electricity as a co-benefit. So it depends massively on the value chains, and this plays very much to the point made by Jason about the need to find out what the genuine co-benefits are, and whether there are any efficiencies around these technologies that can be developed going forward. And if we accept the fact that we are dealing in a deeply uncertain space, and bearing in mind that we haven't had the market mechanisms to incentivize the intellectual brute force that the enormous amounts of venture capital and government incentives around innovation develop, I'm pretty confident that should we be fortunate enough to have a greenhouse gas removal technology or a carbon dioxide removal technology that scales, it hasn't even been invented yet. So, if we are dealing with uncertainty, let's accept the fact that there could be a disruptive uncertainty that that's simply unknown at the moment. But we have to create the appropriate frameworks to cultivate those sort of what Stephen Johnson calls serendipitous coincidences that results in disruptive innovation. Again, a slightly fumbled response, an indirect answer, but yeah, we need to find out if we have a technology that stands a chance of addressing what is tantamount to a seriously existential problem, we would be slightly crazy to not start investigating more about it. And I don't think we have applied sufficient creativity or imagination to this space. And we need to create the responsible construct within which that can happen. So, we have to balance the risk that we're looking to address, or the uncertainty that we're looking to address, and the nature of the risk and uncertainty that we need to engage with in order to address that. I'm not sure that we have done that in the requisite amounts at the moment.
Okay. Jason, and please, I'm going to continue the questions, but if any of you want to add to something, just raise your hand. So, yeah. Jason, I wanted to come to you quickly. You talked about the need for carbon price and to move from voluntary to compliance context. Now, one question that was posed from the floor is, what about removing the billions of dollars of subsidies that the fossil fuel industry is still benefiting instead of as a more effective strategy. Any reactions to that?
Yeah, so I think, by the way, it's obviously a great idea to remove fossil fuel subsidies. I'm very much in favor. I also agree that, by the way, I also think it's worthwhile thinking about agricultural subsidies, which are a major barrier to better agricultural practices, and you could argue are causing all sorts of emissions today. I do think fossil fuel subsidies are a little bit of a red herring. I mean, in the sense that if you look at where much of the subsidies are being spent, a lot of it's in countries with national oil and gas companies. A lot of it's subsidizing consumer use of oil and gas. I think it would have a very positive effect, and it's a shame that we spend the money in that way. I don't think the removal of fossil fuel subsidies would put the oil and gas companies out of business. So I think it's an important first step, but it's a good step. It's a very efficient step. It's the right step, but it's not a game-changing step in my view. The other thing I would mention, by the way, and just in this context of it seems there's always a bit of controversy about the oil and gas companies. I mean, the first question about offsets. I mean, I think the most meaningful way in which we talk about offsets is in the context of who pays, essentially. So you don't have to call it an offset if you don't want to, but the reason it's called an offset is because the people paying for it are paying for it because they're currently emitters, and so they want to, in a voluntary scheme, at least get credit for having paid for it. So they call it an offset against their other emissions. And of course, in a compliance scheme, to the extent that a current emitter is paying for it and they want to call it an offset, I mean, it's really about signaling who pays for it. And so I sometimes wonder why everyone gets upset about the offset language. I mean, I understand it in theory that they don't want it to crowd out other decarbonization and reduction of emissions, and I agree with that 100%. But in point of fact, it's the reason they're called offsets is because the people paying for it are emitters, and we want emitters to pay for it. And so, I mean, I just want us not to get lost in semantics. I mean, there's many reasonable policy pathways in which current emitters pay for negative emissions technologies that are, practically, pragmatically good ways to get these technologies at scale. And if we decide that's not the pathway which we want, which is fine, there's other good pathways for incentivizing these negative emissions technologies. But if we do decide there's other pathways, we need to find someone else who pays. And the other people who will pay will be the general taxpayers. And so for me, the more substantive conversation is about how do we want to set up these negative emissions technology policies and who's going to pay for them. And and calling them offsets is really just because in large part today we're having current emitters pay for them, which is fine, right?
I have Artur and then Louise, but Artur, I was going to ask you anyway to share whether you agree with Jason's thoughts from the EU experience, but maybe you have some other points as well. So go ahead and then Louise.
I wanted to come to what Jason was just saying, because that's a very pertinent point he's making. At the end of the day, in terms of what you capture and store somewhere, either that goes against something that you have emitted, or it's a real net benefit to the atmosphere. So the question in the end is, how much do we need in terms of net removals from the atmosphere? And that's quite interesting because partly the 1.5 report answers this question. You have different scenarios there. And there's one scenario where you have still a lot of emissions in the future that will have to be offset. But that means the demand for these removals is going to be exorbitantly high. And if you look at it, I think in the P4 scenario, you get to more than 1,000 gigatons cumulative only until the year 2100. So that is 220 times the emissions of Europe in a year. So that's what you're talking about in terms of scale. So I think there is going to be scarcity in terms of how many removals you can really realize. And I think that is going to push the emissions out of the equation, because you will need to have these net removals after 2050. And I see in the chat there are some who say the most important thing is to bring the emissions down to zero. Look, even if that happens, after that you will have to get to negative. So it's not a question of just removing all the emissions and then you are fine. Wrong. You still need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere because we have pushed too much CO2 already into the atmosphere. And I think that is the question. I think, Louise, you will spend a lot of time in the coming years in order to try to resolve that for the second half of the century. But we need to lay the foundation now, and it needs to be a solid foundation. And I think the other point where Jason is right in terms of who is going to pay for it, because it's easy to say, yes, all the emissions down to zero, and that is mainly the task of private sector. But when it comes to the net negative, the removals, who's going to pay for that? Are we going to create legislation which says if you want to operate as a company in Europe, one of the tasks you have is to remove 2 gigatons of carbon dioxide over the next 10 years? Is that going to be the new targets we are talking about after 2050? But it's very much future of the music of the future, sorry. In order to deal with that, I think let's try to deal with the next 30 years first.
Yeah. Louise, you had your, but thank you, Artur, for reminding us particularly of the net negative needs beyond 2050. We mustn't forget that. Louise.
Yeah, I would second that. I think there's some really important points there, Artur. And I think you said great at the end there, and let's not forget about the next 30 years. And I think for me, that's where this issue with offsetting in companies comes in. You made the good point, Jason, that it's really good that these companies are actually doing something, and somebody's got to pay for this at the moment, and they're doing it. And I really do think that's a good thing. I think the point I tried to make, I think in my first statement was that one of the concerns with offsetting, though, I think this concern about then not actually reducing emissions is a really big one. And I think it's then maybe more about terminology and how things are framed. We do want to encourage companies to be reducing emissions for paying for negative emissions technologies elsewhere. But by doing it through a framework of offsetting and being able to, for example, claim net zero by 2030 for a company that is still emitting huge amounts of fossil fuel emissions is, I think, a bit risky. But I think it is a very good question of like, well, but how do we keep encouraging those companies to continue to actually do something and be able to take credit for it, while at the same time not being able to claim that they have no impact on the environment, which they still do if they're still emitting. And I think two things there. One is that I think one challenge is almost the flip side of what I said earlier, is that to some extent, some carbon dioxide removal options right now are so cheap, particularly the nature-based ones, that it's quite easy to claim carbon neutrality or climate neutrality on the near term at quite a low cost without reducing emissions. And the second point is more on the, well, how do we actually resolve that? And that's something we've worked out at my institute in terms of how can you either actually almost voluntarily pay a bit more and say why. That's not always going to be possible for all companies, but for some it may be, saying what we're doing is being really ambitious. And the other thing is to not claim through offset saying, well, we have paid for exactly 1 megaton of CO2 that's been removed, therefore we're climate neutral, but rather to say, well, we are actually going to set aside this huge chunk or a substantial chunk of budget to contribute to funding research and development or to support the upscaling of these technologies and processes in another way. And that definitely doesn't have the nice label that you can put on it. But on the other hand, I do see some companies are being quite ambitious. And that was almost a question back to you, Jason, of how do you see, from the perspective of some of the private companies you've worked with, what are their motivation to actually do this? Because there is the economics of it has to come into play, but there is also some integrity and ambition and self-motivation for preservation of the environment that comes from these companies as well. I'm just wondering if you see that as a role.
I see Mark want to respond, but also Jason, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I think the broader issue here is how we deal with uncertainty, and the point that Arthur brings up around the fact that carbon storage, geological or biogenic, is going to be limited is a fair play, but that's based on what we know now. And so I think, I would much rather there be a regulatory construct that allows an iterative approach to the way that we address these uncertainties, because Jason's point is the fact that we are getting counterparties engaging in mechanisms that will allow the development of this sector, which I would much rather have than this fixed future perspective of the fact that we only have a finite amount of storage space. The fact is, if you can pump prime the market within a responsible way, and that's where all the detail and the devil lies, the amount of storage and 1.2 trillion tons of geological storage suddenly becomes a lot more economic to access. You suddenly change the whole game, but you don't realize the economics and the capacity to bring down the cost curve unless you have some kind of market to be brought to bear. And the whole issue around the need for offsetting is almost, if we take it from a consumption-based perspective, we're going to need cement, we're going to need steel, we're still going to eat food. And the fact is that all these sectors cannot technologically mitigate to zero by 2050. So therefore, they need to offset in some way. And if they can pump prime a sector that has broader systemic public goods around the generation of a carbon dioxide removal sector, well, I'd much rather that happen than them not participate and continue to emit out of the fact that they can't mitigate fast enough anyway. So for me, the actual overarching question is, how does policy and regulation accommodate the fact that you're dealing with a perpetually moving process and adaptive system that therefore needs to allow some form of engagement of counterparties within a market to allow the sector to scale and create confidence? And that's something probably where we need to get to. I think the regulatory constructs around here are a long way from addressing.
I'd like to come back to something you said, but I think Jason wants to say something, and Artur then, and then I may want to come back if we have time.
Yeah, sure. I mean, So I agree with that. I think private sector companies are motivated by a number of things, but primarily by profit. I'm not suggesting that there's a lot of benevolence in the private sector, but I think that comes through in a few ways, right? Some of them, I think the Microsofts and the Googles have a certain ethos in their companies. They have something their employees want. They want their employees to buy into. They have a reputation in the market, and somewhere along the line, I'm sure that translates into profit, and hence they're keen to put put some money into these technologies, into offsets, into what have you. The oil and gas companies are under investor pressure, and they want to show a good direction of travel. They're seeking to find the most economic ways to do it. I think they're looking for alternative business models. Like I said earlier, I think some of that's new energy for a lot of them. I think some of it is potentially getting involved in nature-based solutions. I don't think they'll do it at scale, though, on a voluntary basis. There'll have to be an economic model. There'll have to be some profitable model behind it, right? So that's, I think that's right. And then whether or not they pay for it along the way, I think, I'm really more pragmatic about it. I agree the oil and gas companies, their business model is dead, and whether it's very fast or not so fast is largely a matter of policies that have nothing to do with offsets. It's about ICE bans. It's about clean energy policy. It's about renewables support. It's about things that are core to their business model, and we know that that's going to hopefully happen very fast, but we know that it's not going to happen tomorrow, and we know that in the interim between now and the point at which it happens, sometime before 2050, let's hope, they're going to be selling this stuff, and you can tax that further and have it pay for a bunch of new technologies that might create negative emissions in the future, or you cannot do that. And either way is fine in a sense, but I don't see why you would demonize oil and gas companies for if they're going to be paying for this as well. I agree. We shouldn't give them a free ride. We shouldn't let them get a lot of reputational benefits from this. We should scrutinize their net zero plans very thoroughly. I couldn't agree more with Louise on all those points. But at the same time, somebody has to pay, and I'd rather doubly tax the rents of oil and gas companies than tax myself, for example, directly. And to the extent that I don't drive a car, that means I really don't have to pay anything.
Artur.
I wanted to come back to what Mark was saying in terms of the regulatory framework, because I'm not that pessimistic in terms of as him. Because I see exactly the point he's making, that at the moment when it comes to those nature-based approaches, there's rarely direct incentive for the ones who are going to create those assets, those removals. So that is something that we need to create also in Europe in the coming years. And I think what we are doing at the present point in time is to look at what are these voluntary approaches that are around. How do they do the monitoring verification? How do they make sure that a ton is a ton? How do they structure the markets? What is being paid? How is it being paid? What is the transparency in those markets? And we want to use that experience on one hand to stimulate member states to do more in that area, because in the beginning, and the agriculture subsidies have been mentioned, you could use these subsidies in order also to pay for the removals, at least, and would do then some good to the atmosphere, and it would provide some business for farmers. So that is one way of moving forward. The second one is to establish that regulatory framework, and that for us is creating a certification system for those removals, both on the nature-based side, but also on the side of the technologies in the coming 3 years. And then kind of the question is, at what time and how would you link it up with the rest of the market that has been established in the meantime, or that even exists today? I think these are the steps that we want to take in Europe in the coming years. And you're almost welcome to participate in the kind of consultations that are going to happen on that in the coming months and years.
Excellent. Okay. I'd like to come back to a question that was posed from the participants that we sort of began to address. Artur, in particular, you started talking about the scale. And the question was, very simply put, 12.5 gigatons a year is, forget what was the actual wording now, is crazy or something. You know, it's not realistic. So a realm of fantasy, sorry. So is there any other thoughts we can provide from our different perspective of what sort of scale are we talking about, given the situation that we are facing, the reality of where countries are in terms of their emission reduction, current emission reduction plans, and what's expected in the future?
I think what's very clear is if countries would just pursue what they have been pledging in Paris, you probably will have to exceed the 12.5 gigatons per year, because the models of the IPCC are built on more action than what is happening at the present point in time. Mm-hmm. And then I also would agree with what Mark is saying, that and probably we are also looking at that in the current realm of technologies that are available. But we are spending a lot of money also on research in order to see how can we capture carbon in different ways, for instance, in new types of materials, where they would be locked up. Because you can ask the question, why should I deal with this like a piece of waste, and I need to dump it somewhere down in a geological strata to lock it up there? You could also think of, okay, maybe I can make something useful out of it and put it into materials. So mineralization, these are issues that will become big topics in research in the coming years. But that's really fundamental research. And we have seen, or I've seen, some interesting things that come out of the lab in terms of materials that are lighter than aluminium, but stronger, that are built from carbon. So it's not only carbon fiber here we are talking about, but also new mixtures where you would lock the carbon up for a very long time, because it is a stable way of doing that. But I think in terms of material research, we are there at the beginning. And I'm sure that is going to broaden the whole frontier of knowledge and science in the coming years.
I'd like to come to one more question. We're coming to the close. We have 5 more minutes, but there was one question that was very specific, and it's linked, of course, to the United States, where there is some incentives, the so-called 45Q legislation that provides some incentives for carbon removal. And the question was whether we've seen any pipeline of projects. I'm not sure if any of us are experts on the US, but if we can look at this broader, there are incentives in a number of countries and regions. And do we do any of you see a sort of a pipeline of interesting projects emerging out of this in the area of carbon removal?
I mean, there are, look, so I think it depends on which removal technology is again, but I think there has been a lot of development on the land use side. I think it's fair to say that there's very small projects that need to be aggregated. They're not at scale, but there's lots of people running around making projects happen. You've got more than a decade of kind of things being in place. And I do think you're starting to see people look at larger scale models for that. So I think there's a lot of stuff that could be brought together into a significant pipeline on NBS over the next 5 to 10 years. On CCS, I think it's much harder. You've certainly got projects that could be done, but it's piece by piece. It's tax credit by tax credit. It's really kind of, it's still just stuck in a very, it's sort of you just get about as far as the money takes you, and that's the kind of the next project. There's nothing. I don't know that I see, at least. Maybe Mark, you have a different opinion, but I don't know if I see clarity around this is where we're going to have big scale in 5 years because we can see this coming as a.
So I mean, I would like to half answer the 12.5 gigatons a year is a dreamer's paradise, because I think that's quite important in a COVID situation. We need to actually be generating narratives of hope, because when humankind has a possible outcome, we tend to be a lot more creative, and we certainly know what happens when we're negative and divisive, as per one of the candidates for president in the US. I mean, if you told anyone in 1959 that 12 members of humankind would walk on the moon 10 years later, I think they would have thought you were completely nuts, and yet that was possible. If someone told you that somebody would bring together GPS technology, internet technology, and you'd be able to carry it in the back pocket of your phone, and that within 12 years there'll be 20 billion of those kicking around the planet, i.e. 3 for every 1 person on the planet, and it would have developmental impacts in terms of remittances globally, in terms of the capacity for innovation. And then say the GVA contribution of Stephen Jobs' iPhone and the smartphone is substantive. I would have thought you're completely nuts. So we especially in COVID-19, where the future of a lot of the younger generation is being potentially stymied, I think we need to do a narrative of hope. So I think that's very, very important. And I think human ingenuity will allow us the opportunity to generate this at scale. We just have to do it and get our creative juices going. So I think that's very important. In terms of the incentive systems in place, I mean, Q45 is clearly an oil and gas play. It's post revenue, which is a pity. But $35 or $50, depending on how you deal with the carbon, is positive. And obviously, the low carbon fuel standard in California, which I think has a global reach, is for me a more interesting incentive structure, and it was in one of Louise's reports. But there are these ink blots of creativity happening. The issue, and it plays entirely what Jason said, it is just ink blots at the moment, and we can't get that critical mass, and we can't identify what the systemic drivers are that will allow this sector to be established and scale, which is why we're playing to the accelerator piece. You know, in direct air capture, there's Silicon Kingdom Holdings, there's Carbon Engineering, Climeworks, Global Thermostat, Hydrocell, Infinitree, Skytree. There are these organizations. We've only heard of a handful of them, but they are coming about. So I just sort of, yeah, we don't know how effective these things are, but we need to keep trying, and we need to bring critical mass to this space.
Thank you, Mark. I'm sorry, but we're going to have to close. We need to close these things sharp. But thank you very much. I'd like to pull out of one thing you said, Mark, and that could be a way to close our discussion, to have a positive narrative, to think positively about these issues. Also, one last comment from one of our participants who says, why is it more difficult to imagine not burning fossil fuels than to imagine fantastical technological futures? Something to think about. But I think the bottom line here from this discussion, which has been fantastic, I learned a lot, is that there are so many different dimensions of governance, not just what governments need to do in order to create market conditions, but different processes, different actors who all have to work toward the one goal, which, well, in this case, the goal is to eventually reduce the concentration of greenhouse gases. So thank you very much. We've addressed some important issues, but of course not everything. Thank you for your participation. Thank you to the participants, and see you at the next Campfire.